Hi, everybody. I am Angie Abdou at the Great Big Book Club with Jael Richardson. I know a lot of people who are regular festival goers because I come as often as I can home to Moose Jaw, where I was born and raised. I currently live in Fernie, BC and Tanaha territory, but I am home in Moose Jaw, which is so exciting because I haven't been here for 2 years because of COVID. And I drove in yesterday with my daughter, who's 12 and couldn't remember Moose Jaw. So it was so fun driving in with her. And she was saying it's weird here because you can see the sky where it touches the ground. She found so strange living in the mountains. So I was very, very happy to introduce her to my sky here in Moose Jaw. Moose Jaw is on what's called Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Saulteaux, the Dakota, the Nakota, the Lakota, and the Métis people. So we acknowledge at the festival, and myself personally acknowledge the terrible mistakes of the past and the tragic harms. And we're really committed. The festival is very committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous peoples and in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And anyone who's come to the festival regularly knows that Sarah and her whole team are very progressive and sensitive, and they continue to improve the festival every year and make it a safe space for all marginalized groups and to celebrate a diversity of voices. And I know Jael, who's our feature today, she's worked with the festival to help. She works with festivals around the country. So it's a wonderful festival in that way and in many ways. And so I imagine all the loyal supporters that have turned up today appreciate that quality of the festival, as I do, and understand that there is zero tolerance for racist remarks or hate speech of any kind. I know a lot of people in this time right now, especially with the uncovering of all the Indigenous graves of Indigenous children, are thinking how to move beyond land acknowledgements. It's not just enough to say, here we are on Cree Lakota territory, but what do we do? And I have no Indigenous heritage, but I have cousins who do. And my cousin Frank Bush and Angela Bush, they tell me that the steps that you should do to accompany the land acknowledgements is educate yourself, make sure you understand the history of this country, speak the truth, hold government and Catholic Church accountable, and if you're able, donate to the various associations for funding to survivors. So that's what I like to do in conjunction with the land acknowledgement, what otherwise feels pretty empty. And on the topic of donations, we want to thank the Saskatchewan Arts and Culture Board, the Saskatchewan Lotteries, the Canada Council of Arts, and the Government of Canada. And there's a long list of funders who support the festival every year, and they are all on the program. And if you see them around town in Moose Jaw, make sure to thank them. Now I get to introduce the star of the hour, Jael Richardson. Though Gutter Child is Jael's first debut novel, she's no newcomer to the literary arts. Anyone who pays any attention at all to Canadian literature needs no introduction at all to Jael. She's a powerhouse. She's everywhere, a colossal force working for positive change in our communities and in the wider world. She's the director of the Festival of Literary Diversity, the festival's founder. This is a festival which celebrates a range of voices once marginalized in our literary community. She works as a consultant as well, a curator and a moderator for many festivals across the country, and for the Giller Prize as well. We were just having a fun conversation about that. She's looking forward to the fall, which is looking to be very exciting and full for her. She helps festivals make their festivals more diverse and accessible. She's also a book columnist for Q, so you've likely heard her powerful and persuasive voice on CBC One. Jael's first book, The Stone Thrower, A Daughter's Lessons, A Father's Life, came out in 2012. So she's also no neophyte to the writing part of the writer's life either. That memoir is about her CFL football father, Chuck Ely, and she's been in Moose Jaw talking about that. And Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, of course, loves football. So it's an excellent book for us Saskatchewanians. Gutter Child came out just this year with much fanfare. It's an instant national bestseller. I saw it as of today, it's number 4 best-selling book in Canada, which is amazing. And I had to ask her if I'd imagined that it was shortlisted for the Amazon First Novel Award because it's only 2021. I thought there wasn't time for that to happen yet, but she assures me it was shortlisted for the Amazon First Novel Award. Chatelaine calls it a deep and unflinching yet loving look at injustice and power. Quill Inquirer gave it a star review, which called it a powerful and unforgettable novel. I am very excited to have a chance to discuss this book with the author, Jael Richardson. Welcome, Jael. How are you?
Hey, Angie. I'm good. Excited to chat with you always.
Yes, we had a chance to talk earlier in Fernie, a festival I run called Booked, but it was 2 people. We were talking with Ellie Bryan, who had a YA feminist dystopia. So we didn't have as much chance to dig into the book as we do just a one-on-one interview. And also because it's a book club, we can assume people read it. So we don't have to worry as much about spoiler alert. So that's fun. But before we get into the book, I want to talk a little bit about how you balance all the community work you do, supporting other authors with finding time for your own artistic practice. And I've seen that you wrote somewhere that you find writing, maybe even in your acknowledgments, is a very lonely, solitary act, and you really have to remove yourself from even your own family and your wider community. So how do you balance those two things that both require a lot of time and energy, but are also so different and require even such different personalities to manage?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I feel like my personality has been changing. At the beginning of writing, I was like true extrovert, like give me people, give me schools, give me busy rooms. And now COVID hasn't helped, but I've been very much like, leave me alone. Like I like to be alone, and writing really gives me an opportunity to do that. But the balance is tricky. Balancing Fold and writing and just the other things that I do is one of probably the most difficult parts of my life, is figuring out how to make sure family doesn't suffer, and writing, I can meet deadlines, and also that I'm, maintaining the work of Fold, which is really important to me. So I don't feel like I ever have it right. I'm usually like obsessively working on one thing, and kind of like the others are suffering a little bit. So sometimes Fold is really busy and I'm quite obsessive about that. And sometimes writing is really busy and I'm obsessive about that. And, I find parenting to be really hard. Actually, it's probably the hardest piece in the mix of it all, because I don't think I'm naturally like a, hey, play with my kids, get all in there in the dirt kind of mom. I'm kind of like, yeah, let's watch a movie, and like, okay, now you go do your thing, like go somewhere else, find a friend. I have an only child. So I think I have to just really schedule and kind of organize my time. School is my favorite time of year because my son goes out for most of the day, has a ton of fun, and then I can sort of figure out what I can get done during that time frame. It's been really difficult in that regard because it's like all day, every day. And summer has never been my favorite time of year because I'm just like, if I don't have to work, it's fine. But if I have to work or I have writing deadlines, it's really hard to, see my son and say, okay, you've got to go figure out something, and I'm going to go lock myself in a room and write. So those moments are tricky, but school is great. That's why I loved school when I was in it, and I love it even more as a parent.
And we're going to talk more about motherhood, because the theme of motherhood is all throughout your book, but I want to start somewhere before that. So I'm interested in your process, because you've developed an entire society in this book. It's an alternate world, a very class stratified. People are born into a class it's almost impossible to get out of, and have the deck. That doesn't sound that dystopic, does it? It sounds like, but it is a different world. It's not our world. There are clear parallels. But I'm wondering about the process in writing a book like this. Is it something like, do you have the whole world figured out? Did it come to you as an idea and then you had it all figured out before you started? Or did you learn more about the world as you wrote? Or did the character come first and then you have to keep kind of backtracking as you figure it out? I'm just really curious about how a whole world gets developed on the page for a book.
Well, I did it wrong. So I'll tell you what I did. You might not want to copy it. It took me 8 years to write because I didn't really know what I was doing. I had just finished the memoir about my dad's life, and I really wanted to get away from fact and like research and interviews. I wanted to have true freedom. And for me, a dystopia felt like the ultimate opposite of nonfiction. Nonfiction, you're rooted in truth and fact, in these things that actually happened in these places that actually existed. And in dystopia, you can make up everything, not just where it happens, but what the rules are in that place that happens. And that felt initially so exciting and so, just freeing. I started with the idea of the scars on the hand. That was something that was very early on. I knew that was going to be there. And also the debt. I knew that each gutter child was going to have a debt. And that was honestly maybe the only thing I knew. Was that there was going to be these scars and there was going to be this debt. And I started writing Elamina and Elamina's story just on that basis. And I did not think through all the pieces of the world. And so I did get to a point where it was like, what is this? Why is it like this? Have you thought about that? People will be like, what's the backstory? Like, why is this happening? Why are we here? And so I started to sort of try and figure out that backstory, try and figure out, okay, what led to this moment? And not just loosely, because initially there was an idea of like, what would have happened if we had lost the Civil War? That was kind of like an initial thought that was sort of the backstory just resting in the background for a while. But then I really had to go deeper into that and ask questions. And one of the things that I really wanted was I wanted to talk about people being indigenous to the land and being the original inhabitants of the land, and that conversation that happens in African countries in particular, where colonization sort of destroyed the land, the history, the people. That's really where I wanted to go. And so I had to sort of remove that initial backstory and really unpack what I wanted the story to be. And once you figure out, I think the thing with the dystopia, why you should plan it out first is because when you figure out what your inciting event is or what the backstory is, it informs everything about who the characters are, where they go, where the story will end up. And because I sort of started by skipping that in a lot of ways, there was a lot of work I had to do to go back and tie it more tightly together and work the story out a little bit more clearly. My first meeting with my editor was like a series of questions. But what if this? What happens if this? What happens if that happens? And I was like, I don't know. I don't know. And I don't know. And so my first major edit was not necessarily putting all of that into the book, but just making sure I really understood what happened, what needs to go in, what doesn't need to go in, but I need to understand anyways.
So when you were saying the things that you had at the start, and you said you had the scar right away, you said that the scars of the gutter children I had right away. So did you have the idea of the gutter right away? That phrase was with you right away, or did that come later?
Yeah, gutter child. I knew it was going to be called, initially I think I called it the Gutter Project. That was, I knew there was going to be this project. I knew that Elamina was going to have a single scar, and that it was because she had been taken out as part of a project and then sort of reintroduced back into the gutter system. Because one of the reasons it's told in her voice and by a 14-year-old is because one of the launching questions for me in the book is, what happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure? When do you realize it, and what do you do when you realize it? And so Elamina for me was the way of figuring out the gutter system, and also figuring out the differences. What's the difference between a life on the mainland, and what's the difference between the life in the gutter, and how can this one girl sort of tell us or compare those worlds in a way through the choices she makes. And I wanted the reader to figure it out alongside her. I didn't want her to be, sort of telling it in the past and saying, when I arrived at Livingstone Academy, I wanted her right in there figuring it out, and the reader sort of following her through those choices.
I love present tense, and I write very naturally in present tense. And I've seen some people say, oh, you should write past tense so you have the wisdom that comes with reflection. But I like the immediacy, and I like that the reader learning alongside the character. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think it depends on the story. Like, I think that every story you tell, how it's told, who tells it, and who they're talking to is all part of the actual story. So every book I write, I feel like I have to ask myself the question of like, who's telling it? Who are they talking to, and when are they telling that story? And I actually, at one point, it was, I initially tell it in past tense, and then I changed it. I changed the tense at some point. And when I told it in the present tense, it just felt right. That's just, and then it started to make sense to me about why, but I didn't initially know. I just sounded off when she was telling it in past tense.
For people who maybe haven't read the book for a little while and need a refresher, can you briefly explain the gutter, the mainland, and the hill, so they kind of have the landscape?
Yeah. So the landscape, those are the three major places in the novel. The first part of the book is on the mainland. And the mainland is well, I'll start with the gutter. The gutter is where Elamina is born. It's where all the characters who are of Sosi heritage most of them, I should say, are born. And everyone who's born in the gutter has a debt assigned to them. And one of the ways you can pay off that debt is by going to an academy where you're taught a skill and a trade on the mainland, and then you're hired on the mainland. And so you can pay off that debt over your lifetime. And it usually takes until you're a much older adult. One of the other places in the story is the Hill, and that's where other Sosi people are. And you learn a little bit about why that happened, that at the very beginning, there were Sosi people who could pay their way essentially right off the bat, and so avoided going to the gutter and started this place called the Hill. And so that's another place that gutter folks know about. And there's some characters who come from there and complicate the understanding of like what it means to be a gutter child, what it means to be Sosi, what it looks like. And then the mainland is where most of the action takes place, and it's the area where Sosi people were wiped out and pushed into the gutter or to the Hill, and sort of a whole new society was established with the gutter system as a way of saying, if you want to be like us, you have to pay your way and prove that you can be resilient like us, because in battle we essentially proved that we were stronger. And yeah, so that's the premise of the mainland. It's a very dominating, oppressive place, especially for Sosi people. And that's what Elamina has to figure out. She's been raised there. She knows what it's like there, but she didn't really understand what her position on the mainland was.
So I find it interesting that you feel like you say that you did it wrong and that you should have had the whole world. It would have been easier if you had the whole world figured out first. Do you think you could have figured the whole world out, or do you think you had to dive into it imaginatively and let Elamina come to life and let those details work out, and then you kind of backtrack? Like, would it have been possible to sit down and map out the whole idea before it had that life of the creative process?
Well, I'll say, I think for me personally, I think it had to happen that way. I don't think I knew enough about writing dystopias even to know that that was a good idea. And I think also a lot of the things that happen in the story are things that I was unpacking myself. They were things that I was figuring out. You know, what does it mean? What does it mean for women in a society like this? What's the difference between how life is for Elamina and Josephine and Violet versus how it is for Rowan and David? And there are things that I was unpacking in my own life, my own story, that were shaping what I wanted the world to be. There was my own understanding of Blackness and Black identity that were also shaping what the world came to be. So truth be told, I don't think 8 years ago I had the understanding that I would need to write the story as it is now. But as a writer, practically speaking, it would have been more efficient if I had spent, a couple months planning it out and then writing it. And I say that because I'm working on my next novel, and I did spend a lot of time plotting, and it has been at this point way more efficient. To really slow it down, think it through, plot it out, and have strategies for what happens when I change my mind. Because that's the other thing. I just wrote, like I didn't make notes, things. And so I would go through and be like, I don't remember why I did that. I feel like that's significant. Even people have asked me like, why did you name it this? And I was like, I don't remember. Like, I really don't remember. But I've been more careful with the next one to make notes.
Almina is a very compelling character, and she has to be because she holds the story. She's a narrator, and we're rooting for her the whole time to find a way out of this impossible situation where it's designed to have no way out. Her name is important because she changes it partway through when she goes back to the gutter. And then, so she changes it to Lena. Is that right?
Lima, yeah.
Lima. She was born with Lima. She finds out her birth name. But then Rowan, her guy that she has the babies with, he refuses to call her Lima. He keeps calling her Elamina. And Josephine refuses to call her Elamina. Josephine invents a new name, El. So naming's important. What are you trying to say with, I mean, I think I get what you're saying with Rowan. He just doesn't accept that she's evolving and growing and has this power. But what do you say with Josephine refusing to call her Elamina?
So the truth about that, Angie, is I made a bit of a mistake. And it's one of those things, like, I like to write books where I give just enough information. I find, and we might talk about this a little bit with young adults, I think one of the things with young adult fiction is you want to make absolutely sure everything is clear all the way through. And I that's not the style that I like as much. So I try and take out as much as possible and just leave in like little itty bits. So I think that I took out too much when it came to the name, because for me, It wasn't so much of like a reclaiming of her original name when she uses Lima. It was more about hiding and using it
Oh,
like not being found. And I so when Josephine and Rowan continued to call her Elamina, it was I think part of it was him refusing. Like I think he just doesn't care about her safety, right? There's just sort of this thing. And I think with Josephine, it was more like them establishing their own relationship about, you know, this is how I know you. This is how we know each other. And it's interesting because when it comes to colonization, names are big. And there's this sort of understanding like, do you want to go by your original name? Do you go by the name people have just been pronouncing wrong and just accept that? Do you go by a totally new name? And some people like really want to go back to their original. And some people are like, this is who I am. I want to identify where I've been. I also want to be how I know myself when I look at myself in the mirror. So it's interesting because the next book I'm working on, for those that don't know, it's a sequel to Gutter Child, and so that I do address that. I address where Elamina / Lima is going to be, but I think it was for me initially more of a hiding issue rather than a reclaiming. But I do like the reclaiming narrative, so I've had to think about it. I've had to ponder on it more.
That makes sense though, because she changes her name right when she takes her baby and leaves because she doesn't want to be found. That makes perfect sense. And I like the ambiguity that it can be both.
Yes, I do too. I feel like if I were to go back, I'd probably maybe clarify in one more place, but also leave room for it to be both, right? To be both a like, I use this name, but I also still feel like Elamina kind of thing.
So you mentioned Josephine and her developed this relationship around the name of Al, and it's kind of really warm when Josephine calls her Al, and they're so close. And I think friendship and family are so important in this book. A few times, I think David says, I couldn't do this alone. Like you have to have, I couldn't suffer through all this, or there'd be no meaning if I didn't have people. And so it's family is important. And Elamina doesn't have any obvious family, but she makes a family out of Duncan and his mother, and she makes the close friends of Josephine and even Violet, who is, originally their friendship was very hard. The friendships are never easy though, right? Like those people her people she takes on her family are not perfect. They've done horrible things to her in her past. So what are you saying in terms of that, like the complexity of friendships? Well, let me word this better. Yeah, because it relates back to the red coats. As soon as Elamina comes to the school, he gives her a red coat. And so she's a snitch. She's supposed to inform on the other people. So the system deliberately divides people against each other.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I've been really interested in exploring through the dystopia. Dystopia allowed me to talk about Blackness in a way that I couldn't have done in another form. Like I couldn't have set something in Toronto or set something in New York or Chicago and had this really complex discussion about race, because you'd also be discussing place and borders and citizenship and how immigration or belonging, all those things really complicate the conversation about race and Black identity, which is why dystopia was so great for me, because it allowed me to talk about the things that are complex on their own without those things. And one of the things is our relationship to one another as a Black community. We're a part of a system that teaches us to dislike each other, to question each other. I remember growing up and really not knowing if I wanted to be Black, to be honest. Part of it was the word. I felt like the word Black was not something that I considered to be positive, right? So I would go to church and we'd be talking about like, wash me whiter than snow and Black is sin and evil. And then people would call me Black. And white people would be like angels and holy and goodness. And it was a really fraught term to refer to myself as a Black person. And so I also was watching TV and reading books that kind of told me that like whiteness was better, that white people wrote better books and made better movies and were better actors. And then there are people who were more aware than I was, who were contesting these things. But I was kind of like, I don't want to cause problems. I don't want to be the Black person that does these things that makes it more difficult and puts up a fuss. And so I feel like all my life I was being, much like Elamina, being pulled away from my community and being asked to look at my community as secondary. And you see this a lot for people who immigrate here from Caribbean countries, African countries, South American, who are Black, who are told that the country that they're from is not as good, not as rich. The art is not as strong, not as memorable, whatever it is. And there's this sort of like desire, systemic effort to make Black spaces secondary in value, secondary in quality. And so you see that in the story. There are different characters who see being Sosi and being from the gutter in different ways. And they kind of have to, Elamina has to reconcile with what it means to be a Sosi person, to be a gutter child. Lewis is a great example of this at Livingstone. He's been trained from the beginning much more actively to hate his own community, to punish, to question, to value mainland ways over Sosi ways. And Josephine is probably the most aggressively pulling in the other direction to say, like, no, this is who we are, this is who we belong to, and this is something to be proud of. And Elamina is questioning where she falls. And then David, Rowan, and Violet, I think, are questioning what their response to be. I don't think they hate being Sosi or they question being from the gutter, but it's like, how do I get out of this mess, though? I don't want to be in debt. And I think for me, that's what makes all the relationships so complicated, because everybody who's of Sosi heritage is generally struggling in one way or another, emotionally, socially, financially. But the question is, what do you do about it? What's the right way out? What's the right way to live? And you see this in the activist community, in the Black community right now. There's different solutions. You know, some people say don't own property. Some people say, you know, do what everybody else is doing, make money and get your way out, push hard. And then there's people who are sort of in the middle, just saying, like, I just want to live. I just want to do. And I think it's one of the most damaging parts of systemic racism. It's that it doesn't just make life difficult. It divides you from, it's meant or intended to also divide you from each other, to say, like, this is the hierarchy, and those of you who can reach it are going to be more successful, more praised, more acknowledged. And the people who are struggling to change the whole system are going to struggle the hardest and have the least. And that's it's really sucky. That's what you know, as I was writing the book, I'm like, this is really like crappy. Like, what do we do? And you know, I was trying to figure that out as I was writing, really. I was trying to look at the world that we're living in, make some comments on it, but also come to a solution.
Oh, what is your solution when we get towards the end?
I don't.
Because we do have a gesture towards, but just to back up for people who maybe haven't had a English lit class for a while, the definition of dystopia, the simplest one I know, is a book that takes strands from our current society and usually projects them forward into, you know, a negative outcome, a world that exaggerates those bad directions, those bad trajectories into a future. In Jael's case, it's not forward into the future, but alternate. What would have happened if the Civil War went differently? So it's not a futuristic thing. It's very, and that the threads are so obvious, the things you take from our society in the context in which your book has come out, with the George Floyd, with the Black Lives Movement gaining momentum, with the increasing awareness of the Indigenous graves. And so it's not hard at all to draw parallels from your book to what's going on in our world. And I found when I read it the first time, I read it as being very specific to the Black experience. And when I read it this time, I really saw a lot of parallels to the 60s scoop or the residential schools, because Elamina is taken away from her family, raised by a woman who doesn't look like her. And there's a line somewhere where it says, like, if you are always looking at a face that's not your own, not the same race, you don't learn to value what's beautiful about yourself. And that is a powerful statement in this country where that's so common. So I made me wonder, when you wrote it, it sounds like you've already answered this. You weren't necessarily writing about the Black experience. You're writing about the experience of people from indigenous to the land being displaced.
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple iterations where that became a big question, was, you know, who am I talking about? And if I was casting this in the movie, would everybody who's Sosi be Black? That was like a big question I had, and I wasn't sure of the answer for a long time, because what I was really looking at was systems and colonization. And colonization we know it. Well, I hope we know it well in Canada as it relates to Indigenous people, because that's our history. That's the story here of wiping out Indigenous communities. But it happens all over the world, and it happened in almost every African country. It happened, everywhere. And the thing that was really hard for me in the end was I felt like, I remember going out for lunch with a friend, a Black woman, and I said, should I talk about the Black community? Should I make this about the Black community, or should I keep it broad and sort of address all oppression? Because I was always also thinking about the Dalit people in India who are considered the untouchables. And that was an idea that was sort of at the very beginning as well, the caste system in India, and, the gutter being sort of the lowest caste. And she said, don't be afraid to just talk about the Black community, to really hone in and narrow in on Black identity and Black experiences, because so often as Black folks, we feel that pressure. We know what it's like to be excluded. And so we feel the pressure to carry everybody's stories, to address everyone's concerns. And it's okay to just be in Black experiences. And in the end, that was probably the best advice, because I realized how complex the Black community is. I mean, it's one of the issues that people don't often realize is the Black community extends beyond nation. There's no place and nation in which we originate from altogether. And there's also, it's very difficult for some of us to trace where we're from, where we began. And that was one of the trickiest parts about writing the backstory is, I couldn't say, my ancestors are Ghanaian, I'm going to go look at the history of Ghana and unpack how they were removed from their country. I had to just say, I don't know where I'm from. I don't know where my people are from. My parents are American. And so my ancestors are slaves, all the way back. And so that's one of the unique things about the Black community, which makes talking about it really complex, as I mentioned before. And so, yeah, that was on my mind a lot, trying to figure out what to talk about and who I was talking about. And I really, in my mind, every Sosi character in the book is Black. And that became, and I say that I should put quotations about it, because I tell people always don't refer to the characters as Black, because that's, but in my mind, in terms of picturing their face and simplifying it to what do they look like? That is what they look like. They look like the term we would use for Black people. And that was a decision I made that helped me be more specific in the story, helped me, I think, craft better versions of Violet, Josephine, David, Rowan, because I was really being specific to the things that were on my mind. And I was wrapping up the story last year after Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And so it helped to be okay, let's figure this out, kind of.
Yeah, I think I must have seen a tweet where you said, don't confuse interpretation with summary. So if you're saying the characters are Black, that's an interpretation based on, some hints in the book, but it's an interpretation. I wanted to talk about, I was just on a family holiday and we listened with the kids to The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. And I know you're familiar with that book and that you've interviewed Angie Thomas. And I was thinking about, her book is very much realism, but I was thinking about the similarities in that these characters are born into a class where the odds are so stacked against them, and there are opportunities for getting anywhere, or even staying afloat and surviving, are so few that it seems like maybe they chose to be a drug dealer when that's hardly a choice. It's just what are they going to do to feed their family? And they just have, the class is stacked against them. The economic system is stacked against them. They have no opportunities. And I was like, this is realism. Jael's book's dystopian, but they're so similar in the themes they address. And that, especially that notion of being trapped and in a system that has not got your back, right? Yeah. And so I was going to originally ask you what a dystopic vision brings that realism can't bring, but you've already answered that you wanted to free it up from a certain place. So what I'd like to use that comparison instead to talk about is YA fiction versus adult fiction, because Angie Thomas is very much marketed as young adult fiction for teens. You're marketed as adult literary novel, yet you've done a classroom guide and you do classroom visits and teenagers read it. So how would you distinguish audience for you versus Angie Thomas? Am I saying that right? Angie Thomas.
Yes. And it's funny, I asked Angie about this when we were talking, and it actually, her answer was oh, I get. Because I think people have asked me if it's young adult, and I don't quite know how to answer it. because they're looking at the final product and saying, okay, the main character is 14, the novel covers 14 to 18. Most of the characters are young, so 1 + 1 = 2. And I started with the end result. And the end result was I wanted to figure out like what happens when you realize you're in a failed system. And for me, 14 felt like the best age to approach those questions, largely because that's when I was going through it. So it felt like, 14 is when you start to look around and be like, really? Is that what we're dealing with here? Is that what the world looks like? Oh my gosh. And over the course of like up until, I'm still doing it, but I very much thinking about this 14 to 20 was like big moments for me to have some big realizations about the world. So for me, I didn't pick the 14-year-old narrator because I wanted a 14-year-old narrator. I picked a 14-year-old narrator because the story required a 14-year-old narrator in my mind. And when I asked Angie about it, she was the opposite. She said, I write for teens. I want these books that I create are for teens. They're about teens. She wrote a prequel to The Hate U Give called Concrete Rose. And the main character, the father in The Hate U Give, is the central character in Concrete Rose. But the whole story is when he's 17. And it's because she's like, I wanted teens to read it. I wanted them to see themselves. And so I think for us, we had different ways of approaching story. And she's very much like, I'm all in young adult. And I just feel like I write the story in the way that I feel it needs to be told. And if young adults read it, they read it. But I did, when we had to like nail down the title or the category, one of the things that happens is you talk with your publisher and your editor, and the question becomes like, where do you want to find it in a bookstore? That's really like the big questions. And what list, if you're going to be on the bestsellers list, like what list do you want to be involved in? And that both of those things didn't factor in as much. The big thing was I chose adult fiction because people said, young people will read up, but adults won't read down. And I wanted as many people as possible to come across the book and read it and not feel that there was this barrier, for whether that barrier is a good idea or not. I would say I didn't want that barrier to be there. So that's ultimately why I decided not to put the young adult label on it. And I like it. I'm happy with that choice for me.
Mm-hmm. So you had no ideal reader in mind when you were writing. You don't work that way, that you're writing to someone or to an ideal.
Wow. I do. I remember asking, I was talking to Eden Robinson actually at Festival of Words. I don't know how many years ago, what is time these days? Yeah. And I asked her that question about how she decides like who she writes for. And she says, I write every book to one person. And it's sometimes like a family member. It's sometimes a friend. It's sometimes some guy I met at a gas station. And I was struggling with that. Like, who am I writing to? Am I writing to adults? Am I writing to white folks? Am I writing for Black folks? I could not come up with an answer. And ultimately, I kept picturing myself at 14 and the book that I needed to read and the book that would have got me to think about things that I was not yet thinking about, that would have got me to say, oh, wait, you can write like this. And so that's where my heart was. And so that's who I had in mind, myself at 14. And yeah, I was reading up. I was reading like classics and I was reading way up. So it was a mixture. People say, okay, then you were writing for teens. I'm like, I guess so. Whatever that means to you. That's what I was thinking about.
I'll give it to my 14-year-old boy. He's just finishing The Hate U Give right now. So I will give it to him. What other books? So I always like to think about what books any novel is in conversation with. And I when I'm writing a book, I usually have a stack of books that are kind of, I'm just hoping their energy radiates and fills the room or something. Did you have idea in your head of what books this book enters into conversations with, or books that influenced you?
I mean, at the time, the one that really influenced me was Sula by Toni Morrison, which is a dystopia. And if you ever it's a classic. I mean, you might be able to get it. Well, you should be able to get it anywhere. You might be able to find like the first pages online, but you read the opening pages and it's about the bottom and the hill and the people like moving back and forth in these two places. And I remember reading that for the first time in university and being like, what? Is this a real place? I did not know about dystopias at the time. I didn't really understand the genre. And I was just blown away by this book that said so much by saying so little, right? Like I didn't know, is it America? Is it Canada? Where is this? And yet I felt so deeply connected to the story. And so when I started to set out Gutter Child, I had Sula with me all the time. I would open it up and I would read things and I would think about things and how Toni Morrison did it. And yeah.
Beautiful. And I thought a little bit when I was reading, occasionally I would think of Handmaid's Tale, which is a dystopia about the control of reproductive rights and motherhood. And that's something that is very prevalent throughout your book, is the part of the way they have power over people is by taking control of motherhood and reproduction. Yeah. And so how important, when did that theme come to you and how consciously is that woven throughout?
Yeah, that was a big, that was one of those, like when I was talking about my editor meeting, one of the big questions was like, what happens to pregnant women? And I can't remember if it was my agent or my editor who said, you know, what happens to pregnant women is the key to any dystopian society, because it tells you how they value life and whose lives they value. You know, is the baby important and the mother is not? Is a baby a threat? And so that was a big question for Elamina, and Elamina's journey is like that moment at the end of part 1, that chapter where she's talking to Mr. Gregors changed multiple times over the course of writing the book, because the question became is like, what does Mr. Gregors really want when he finds out that Elamina is pregnant? Spoiler, those read it. That evolved actually over the course of those first 4 to 6 years, was really like what is it that they want from that? And actually understanding what they want from Elamina and with her baby is how I came to arrive at where the story went. Was really, really, you know, and I talk about being vague for the first few years. That was one of the things I hadn't really like nailed down. What are they going to do with the baby? What's going to happen to Elamina? I had to really think that through. And when I did, boom, awesome. The whole journey of the story became more clear.
Your editor sounds brilliant. So let's shout out to the editor. What's your editor's name?
Jennifer Lambert.
Oh, Jennifer Lambert. I didn't know that. That was a legitimate question. Oh, I've heard so many good things about her.
Amazing.
I have 2 really short, easy questions, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. One, this is, again, something that didn't occur to me all of the first reading, even though I'm very interested in sport literature and what different sports signify. I didn't think to question this, but this time in my read through, I wondered about Rowan, who's a character who's so hard to like. He makes so many mistakes. But why boxing? Did you consider giving him a different sport? Why did you make him a boxer?
I love this question. Thank you, Angie. Because I genuinely, I did a school visit and there was a boy named Rowan in the class. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But I have to say, I love all the characters. And I really tried to make, especially in those 5 characters who at moments you would hate and at other moments you would love or could admire. And so I said to this in a book club yesterday, I said, when you don't like a character, really unpack that, like spend some time with that. When you're really angry that a character does X, ask yourself why. What about where you've been, you've done, the choices you've made would make you more likely to like Elamina or Josephine versus Rowan or David or someone. So that's just a fun homework assignment. But Rowan boxing was, so I was really setting the story in the 60s. That was really where my head was at. And I had done a lot of research when my dad, when I was writing the book about my dad, about sports history and about Black athletes in the 60s. And first of all, boxing was my mom was the one who told me this. She was like, at the time in the 60s, there was a boxing gym on every corner. It was the sport in the Black community because you didn't need very much to do it, because you're fighting. You're actually physically doing something about the struggle that you're likely experiencing at home and around you. And so there was a whole culture. That was one of the main reasons. And it was also based on the true story of a boxer who was very successful, did very well, but got in so much trouble because he was often dating white women. And so his career fell apart, not because of boxing, but because of, this pattern in his that was not allowed. And the other thing that I really liked about boxing is because it's such a, I don't know what word to use. It's such a brain fart. I'll just say it's a constant battering of your brain, which is also, a reference to racism and the way it's a constant beating on your brain. And so for Rowan, the things that happen to him and the things that he does afterwards, the question is Is it the social pressure? Is it the physical pressure? What is it that causes his life to take such a harsh turn? And boxing for me is I mean, football would also be great, but then you'd have to make a whole team and it would be complicated. So, the pressure, the beating on his brain, on his head, for 10 years of his life have an impact. And so that's really it had a lot of wins for me in terms of story.
And I love the way his career plays out, is so rich metaphorically and so much. And I won't give that away for people who haven't read it yet, but it's very, very telling of the society, the way his career plays out, because it's yet again a thing that's supposed to be an opportunity for escape. Yes. It's not.
I should say it's also a pattern that we see played out even now. I mean, we're seeing it in Olympic stories and things like that. There's this sort of and at the time in the 60s, there were a lot of instances of Black athletes whose lives kind of fell apart as a result of the pressures. And I still don't really know why. I want to unpack it more. I might write another sports fiction story, but it's because I was really, I just got to do a sneak peek at Rowan's story, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. I have one more question, and then I can see there's already some questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, just get them in there. So at the end, it's not like anyone's escaped the system, but there's a little bit of hope. There is some rebellion and there's some light, and it comes through story. And I'm not going to say how that, just for anyone who hasn't read it yet, because it's really beautiful the way the story the way Elamina's story comes to a wider audience. So for me, I read that as a metaphor for what you think the power of story is to change. So can you talk a little bit about the connection between story and hope?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great question. So one of the things that I was thinking about, when I was working on Gutter Child, I interviewed Colson Whitehead, who wrote Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys. And I remember somebody asking him whether he thinks books can change things and change the world. And he was like, no. And I was like, what? And people in the audience were like, oh my gosh. And it was interesting because I ended up turning to him and saying, but maybe a book single-handedly isn't going to change the world. But if a book impacts somebody and I'll use a very obvious one, like Barack Obama, and it changes him, it changes his worldview, and that he becomes a leader who is in a place to execute change. Can't a book, doesn't literature, books, words, don't they change the world by changing individuals? And he was kind of like, And I was like, yes, okay. And so that's to me where I ended up evolving from. A book, yes, on a shelf is not going to change the world. But a book that's read by someone who's open to it, who's affected by it, I think that person can make change, and that change can change the world. And so for me, there are a number of references to literature, to poetry, to story, to the way that story affects us. And I think that story for me, has been the most influential way I've changed. It's the most influential. I was, even as a person of faith, I used to read the Bible all the time, and that's changed me as a person. It's changed me in good ways. Some of them were bad, but a lot of it's been good. And then fiction and novels and nonfiction have added layers to that, have made me, I think, a better person, and have allowed me to do the things that I do that maybe make the world better for somebody else. And so that's, I think, what I wanted to come across is, when we talk about race and racism, for me, hope lies in listening to stories and hearing people that we have ignored, hearing people that we have not given space to. That's how we change. That's how we move past this mess. I wouldn't say past, move through this mess that we're in right now, that we've set up for ourselves, that the system, the society has set up, is we listen to the stories of the people we have been ignoring, pushing to the corners, etc., for too long.
And it's so beautifully done in your story. The way it's not like someone finds Elamina's story and everything changes overnight. It's like this kind of bubbling and building where just someone's listening and then someone else is listening and then someone else is listening. You can feel the change pushing. It's like there's this darkness and it's like pinprick of light, pinprick, and the pinpricks grow, and her story gains momentum. It's very beautifully Very beautifully and optimistically in the end. I'd say that part of it is a very optimistic vision.
Yes, I will say, I feel like if you don't see the end as optimistic, just read it again. Think it through.
Yeah. So we have questions. It's been delightful talking to you. I always love talking to you. And the intern will attest to that. Jael and I got online a half an hour early and we immediately launched into it. It was like we started a half an hour before everyone else got here. So we have endless things to talk about and it's been delightful. And there are questions in the chat, so I'll read them out to you. The first one is, how did you come up with the setting for the book?
So the setting really came from the big inciting event that I remember was the Trayvon Martin case. And if you don't remember, Trayvon Martin was shot and killed on his way home from the convenience store. He had iced tea and a Skittles in his hand, and he was shot by George Zimmerman in Florida. And when George Zimmerman was acquitted, I was devastated. And I was in my 30s. Like, it wasn't like a childhood devastation. It was a grown adult being like, what the hell is going on in this world that this could happen, that a kid could be killed on his way home from the store, and someone could say they're just defending their property. And I looked at my dad, and my dad said, well, of course he got off. The rules were built for George Zimmerman. They weren't built for Trayvon Martin. And I don't know how to explain other than to say that, like, light bulb moment, like when you watch cartoons, it's like ding, ding, ding. And I immediately thought of those paintings of the founding fathers in America signing the Constitution. And suddenly I realized, these were all, straight white men building laws that formed the foundation of America, all with their own needs and concerns in mind. They were building laws thinking, what happens if my slaves revolt? What happens if I want to move? What happens if my wife is threatened? These are the concerns that were on their mind, and that's the laws that came into play. And we're still living under those laws built by those men. Canada, same thing. And so for me, Gutter Child was about looking at a world like that. Could I create a world that was built knowing that a certain group were being thought of and another group was being ignored? And then could I take it apart? Spoiler, yes to no to question.
Not yet. The question too. Two more questions in the chat and then we're out of time. But the second one is, the book focuses significantly on community and finding community. Why was this discussion of community in Alameda, finding a community among other gutter people, important for you to discuss?
Mm-hmm. This was huge. So I grew up middle class in a suburban neighborhood, mostly white friends. My parents were only children, so I had no aunts, no uncles, no cousins growing up. All of their friends were white. And so I just did not have exposure to my own community. And I think that's why some of the negative things that I thought about my own community were able to take root, because I did not have anything to sort of counter it in any significant way. And when I met my husband and I met his family, his parents have like many, many aunts and uncles, many, many cousins. And it was then that I started to realize what community does, that it exposes you to a variety of people, and that you're not just relying on what you see on the news or what you see in movies to define who you are as Black people. You're seeing Black people of all different kinds all the time, every holiday, every vacation, every birthday. And you have a really rich sense of like what's possible, what might happen. And I think that that's, for me, what I wanted to show people is that the damage of systemic racism is what happens when we separate people, when we segregate them, when we leave them to sort of be filled with the truth from like government, TV, books, and what changes when we allow people to form community, when we create space for them to share stories. Yeah, that's what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the last question, if readers enjoyed your book and are looking for books that are like Gutter Child, what would you recommend? Other than your sequel. Actually, you can tell us a bit about your sequel too, and when we can expect.
Yeah, I'll tell you a bit about the sequel in wrapping it up too. I would say there was a really great piece by Samantha Garner in the, I want to say 49th Shelf, where she recommends a bunch of sci-fi dystopian type books, and Gutter Child is one of them. So if you put into your Google search sci-fi 49th Shelf, you should find that list. And if you don't, I'll repost it on my Twitter account. But I will say Crosshairs by Catherine Hernandez came out in the fall, has some very similar themes. Why am I also, because I'm just thinking of ones that I've read recently. Salima Nawaz wrote a book about like COVID, a little bit more like medical sci-fi dystopia.
Songs from the End of the World.
Songs from the End of the World. There's a whole section in my Empire of Wild as well by Sharita Malign. I love. Oh, and Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waukesha Rice for sure. American War by Omar El-Akkad. Those would be some really strong. Actually, it's funny. On the back of the book, the people who've recommended it,
the people
all of them, have written dystopias of a similar nature, which is one of the reasons I asked them to read it. So you can just look on the back of the book if you have.
So there is quite a strong genre in Canadian dystopia.
There is, especially I think among BIPOC writers, because like I said, I think dystopia allows a lot of room to talk about some of these things, about immigration, about race, about topics like this. It allows the room to talk about them in a really special way, and to sort of leave out the things that make it complicated, honestly. So you can talk about what angle might be of most interest to you.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you close by telling us about your sequel, both like what story it follows, but also the process of writing it, how that's been, and then when we can expect it.
Sure. So process is much more efficient. So I spent a lot of time plotting it out and thinking through what was going to happen and where it was going to end. And so from the beginning, I've been working beginning to end, which is a process that wasn't there at with Gutter Child. With Gutter Child, I was working like beginning to middle, playing around, never quite arriving at the end. And I would just say the big shift in the second 4 years of working on Gutter Child was always working to the end, always thinking about where the ending is, because it changes what happens for your characters and how they evolve over the story. So I'll tell you anything that I know will be in the blurb. That's sort of my rule of like what I share. And so the sequel takes place 25 years in the future, and it covers a couple of characters, many of the characters from this book from Gutter Child, but also a few new characters. And it's really about looking at one of the reasons the book ends the way it does is because I couldn't quite figure out. I could figure out how to build a system, how to make a system stronger, ironically, which is what we see happening in our lives, but I could not figure out how to tear it apart. And that was realistically, I just couldn't figure out how in 30 pages, I could make it all go away. Mm-hmm. And it's because systems are designed to become stronger and not to be torn apart. And so the in what ways do they fall apart? Can they fall apart completely? In what ways do they still remain and exist and have impact even many years later? So
is it optimistic? Hopeful?
I mean, I think hopefulness is relative. And I think optimistic is hard to say. I say when I'm looking at books, I feel like with dystopia, you have three choices about how to end: optimistic, pessimistic, or realistic. And I'm always leaning towards realistic, which is why Gutter Child ends the way it does and why the next one ends the way it does.
Well, the romantic in me is rooting for David and Elamina. I'll just say that. Trying to read your expression.
I am romantic, I will say. I'll just give you
it has been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm so happy again to be here in Moose Jaw. Thank you to the Festival of Words, and thank you for all the sponsors, and thank you to everyone who came and listened. Make sure you check out the whole program online. Jael and I will be in conversation again later today. And you have what other events do you have? You have
just this evening doing the panel discussion on festivals, and so yeah, I'm really excited about that.
So festivals from the author's perspective will be Jael, Guy Vanderhey, and Harold Johnson, and I get to interview them all. So that will be very fun. And there's some online. There's a couple in-person events, and I saw someone on Twitter say that they hope the festival would continue its online programming once the world returns to normal. And I have an inside source that is going to happen. They've really been found it helpful to hear from people remotely or people with accessibility issues that have been able to take in all these festival events. So they're happy for that new avenue of expression for their festival. So I think there will always be online components. And so, yes, to that Twitter question. And thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Jael.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you tonight. Bye, everyone.